Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are exploring one of the most profound and honestly fiercely debated timelines in all of history. We're looking at the theological and historical events that went down right between Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection. We're going to unpack exactly what happened during those mysterious 3 days in the grave. And as we do, we'll make a really clear distinction between the actual biblical texts, later church tradition, and centuries of theological development. Okay, let's dive into this.
Here is our roadmap for the study today. We'll start with the ancient waiting room, then look at Christ's descent into Hades, followed by Scripture versus church tradition, the Matthew 27 saints, and finally, keys to the kingdom.
Part 1. The Ancient Waiting Room. To really grasp what happened during those 3 days, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the ancient world and understand how they viewed death. In the ancient mind, whether you were a Hebrew calling it Sheol or a Greek calling it Hades, the underworld wasn't Dante's Inferno. It wasn't just fire and brimstone. Actually, it was viewed as an inevitable house of assembly for literally anyone who lived and died, a dusty, silent realm of shadows. It didn't matter if you were the most wicked king or the holiest prophet. Eventually, everybody checked into this same divine waiting room. The gates were locked from the inside, and man, the grave had a 100% success rate. It was a one-way valve. You check in, but you never, ever leave.
And this brilliantly illustrates how that first-century worldview was structured. According to Jewish tradition, Sheol was divided into compartments. On one side, you had a place of torment. But on the other side, separated by this impossible, uncrossable chasm, was a place of peace and waiting known as Abraham's bosom. Jesus himself actually presents this exact worldview in Luke 16. You know the story of the rich man and Lazarus, right? Where the righteous rest at Abraham's side while the wicked suffer across that great divide.
Moving right along to Section 2, Christ's descent into Hades.
Now, this entire cosmic setup faced a massive crisis on a very specific weekend in history. Let's look at the timeline. Friday, Jesus yields his spirit on the cross. His physical body goes into the tomb, but according to the source material, his spirit descends. Think about it. For centuries, the inhabitants of that shadow world had heard nothing but the footsteps of more people arriving. But on this particular Friday, the strong man of death heard a knock on the one-way door of the grave. Then we had Saturday, the full day of this descent, which of course is followed by the bodily resurrection on Sunday.
The scriptural basis for this descent is anchored right here in passages like Ephesians 4. It says, "In saying he ascended, what does it mean but that he had also descended into the lower regions, the earth?" You also see this in 1 Peter 3, which mentions Christ making a proclamation to the spirits in prison. So the New Testament writers clearly maintain that Jesus didn't just sleep in a tomb. He actively entered those lower regions.
That brings us to Section 3, Scripture versus church tradition.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how we can visually delineate the inspired texts from how later generations so vividly imagined the event. On the left, we have biblical texts like Acts, Ephesians, and Peter. They give us the foundational, yet admittedly kind of brief, theological facts of the descent. But look on the right, a church tradition. Over centuries, you get texts like the Apostles' Creed explicitly stating he descended into hell. Then you have apocryphal writings like the 4th century Gospel of Nicodemus and medieval mystery plays that added highly dramatic, imaginative narratives to fill in the gaps of what that descent actually looked like.
This vividly imagined tradition eventually became known as the Harrowing of Hell. That term actually comes from the Old English word hergian, which means to harry, lay waste, or despoil. In this dramatic tradition, Jesus is pictured as this triumphant warrior. He's physically breaking down the bronze doors of Hades and personally reaching out to rescue captives like Adam and Eve straight out of the shadows. It's a very powerful image.
But because the actual biblical texts are so brief, different Christian branches have historically interpreted this event in some wildly different ways. Just to impartially lay out the source material here, the Eastern Orthodox tradition views it as an explosive victory. St. John Chrysostom famously described it by saying, "Hell took a body and met God face to face. It took what it saw and fell by what it did not see." Meanwhile, the Roman Catholic tradition developed the idea of the limbo of the fathers, where Christ descends not as a chaotic conqueror, but as a high priest declaring salvation is finished. And then Protestant reformers like Calvin and Luther had their own varying views. Some emphasized the descent as Christ suffering the ultimate penalty, while others saw it as a purely metaphorical triumph.
Let's transition to Section 4, the Matthew 27 saints.
This brings us to Sunday morning, and honestly, one of the most debated and mysterious passages in the entire New Testament. It's found only in Matthew's Gospel. It reads, "The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city. Now, some modern critical scholars, guys like Mike Licona, have called this a weird residual fragment or a poetical legend just meant to add some special effects to the crucifixion story. But historically, the broad spectrum of Orthodox scholars viewed this completely differently.
Let's move to the sequence and see how this builds chronologically, because a close reading of the text shows a very specific timeline. Step 1 happens on Friday. At Christ's death, an earthquake splits the rocks and the graves are opened. But notice, the saints do not leave yet. Step 2 is Sunday. Jesus resurrects, acting as the ultimate first fruits of the resurrection. And finally, Step 3, only after Jesus is resurrected do these saints actually rise and walk into the holy city.
And, the early church fathers were virtually unanimous in treating this as a literal historical fact. Ignatius of Antioch, writing very early on, noted that Christ rose accompanied by a multitude. Irenaeus used it as apologetic proof of Christ's victory. And St. Augustine explicitly defended the gospel writers as historians. He called these events facts and things that were done. They didn't see this as a legend at all. For them, it was the immediate physical proof of the spiritual jailbreak that had just occurred in the unseen realm.
Which brings us nicely to our final part, Section 5, Keys to the Kingdom. So what's the ultimate theological resolution of this descent? The sources point us straight to Revelation 1:18, where Christ declares that he holds the keys of Hades and of death. Think of this as the ultimate cosmic jailbreak. By paying the price for sin and passing right through death, Jesus legally annulled Satan's authority over the grave. He didn't just visit the underworld as a tourist. He went down as a conqueror and took the keys.
So the crucial point is what happens next. Ephesians 4 says, "When he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive." Theologians argue that Jesus literally emptied that righteous compartment of Sheol, Abraham's bosom. He gathered all those Old Testament saints who had been waiting patiently in the shadows and led them upward into their new heavenly destiny. The grand conclusion of this 3-day timeline is a massive tectonic shift in biblical cosmology. Paradise was relocated. Because of the events that took place between Friday and Sunday, that holding place in the center of the earth is no longer the destination for the righteous. The gates of the heavenly paradise were officially thrown open. We've covered a ton of ground today, from the dusty waiting room of ancient Sheol to the historical debates over resurrected saints walking the streets of Jerusalem, all the way to Jesus seizing the keys of death itself. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to consider. How does understanding the theology and the sheer immense cosmic scale of these 3 days in the grave change your own view of the Easter story? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating topic with me. See you next time.